There was a version of you that used to explain everything. Why you left, why you said no, why you didn't answer the phone, why you changed, why you stopped, chasing people who never turned around to see if you were still there. That version of you is tired. And somewhere between the last apology you didn't owe and the last justification you gave to someone who never deserved one, a quieter, harder truth started to surface. You don't need permission to be who you are. Marcus Aurelius never explained himself to Rome. Epictetus, born a slave, never explained himself to the men who owned his body but never owned his mind. Seneca, standing before an emperor who wanted him dead, did not explain. He simply was until the very end. Today we take their sharpest teachings and turn them into something you can use tomorrow morning. 10 lessons, 1 transformation. Stay until the end, because lesson number 7 will change how you walk into every room for the rest of your life. Welcome back to Wisdom of the Stoics, ancient wisdom for the modern mind. If this is your first time here, we take the philosophy that helped emperors rule, slaves find freedom, and exiles find peace, and we translate it into something you can actually use in your Monday morning meeting, your family group chat, and your quietest moments of doubt. If you've been here before, you already know what's coming. Sit with this one. Let it work on you. Here's a question I want you to actually sit with, not just scroll past. How many hours of your life have you spent explaining yourself to people who never once tried to understand you? Not people who deserved clarity, not people who earned an explanation through love, loyalty, or good faith. I mean the ones who demanded it, who made your peace conditional on their comprehension, the relative who needed you to justify your career choice, the friend who needed you to defend your boundaries before they'd respect them, the ex who needed a paragraph before they'd let you go. The Stoics had a word for what you were doing in all of those moments, though they never used it directly. They called it giving away your assent, handing over the one thing that was always, entirely, yours to control, your own judgment of yourself. Epictetus opened his entire philosophy with a single brutal division of the universe. Some things are up to us. Everything else is not. Your body is not fully up to you. It ages, it gets sick, it dies regardless of your will. Your reputation is not up to you. Other people build it. Twist it, forget it, however they choose. But your judgments, your choices, your reactions, those are yours entirely, untouchably yours. And explaining yourself to someone who has already decided not to understand you is an attempt to control something that was never within your power in the first place, their perception. This video is not about becoming cold. It's not about cutting people off or building walls. The Stoics were not hermits who abandoned society. Marcus ruled an empire. Seneca advised emperors. Epictetus taught hundreds of students. They were deeply engaged with the world. What they refused to do was outsource their inner peace to it. 10 lessons. Real stories. Real philosophy. Let's begin. Quick request before we go further. If you've ever caught yourself over-explaining a decision that needed no defense, drop a 1 in the comments right now. I want to see how many of us are healing from the same exhausting habit. Elena had rehearsed the conversation for 3 days. She was 34, a senior designer at a mid-sized firm, and she had finally decided to turn down a promotion that would have doubled her salary and tripled her hours. She knew her father would call. She knew he'd ask why. She knew he'd bring up the mortgage, the retirement fund, the years he'd worked a job he hated so she wouldn't have to. So she prepared a defense, bullet points almost, reasons stacked like sandbags against a flood she was sure was coming. The call came. Her father asked why, and Elena, for the first time in her adult life, said something that surprised even her. Because it's what I want. Silence on the line. Then, quietly, her father said, "Okay." And that was it. The flood she'd spent 3 days preparing for never arrived, because it had only ever existed in her own anticipation of judgment. Here is what Elena didn't know yet, but would come to understand. Most of the explanations we owe people, we invented ourselves. Marcus Aurelius wrote something in his private journal. never meant for publication, never meant for an audience, which is exactly why it carries such weight that cuts directly to this. He reminded himself again and again that other people's opinions of his actions were not his responsibility to manage. He could act with integrity and let the verdict fall where it may. The moment he tried to control their verdict, he had already lost his footing. Think about the last time you over-explained a decision. Did the other person actually demand an explanation, or did you hand one over before they even asked? Because some old, wounded part of you assumed you needed to earn the right to choose your own life. This is the trap. When you explain yourself to justify your worth, you are implicitly agreeing that your worth was up for debate in the first place. It wasn't. It never was. Epictetus taught his students a simple test. Before you explain yourself, ask, is this person owed clarity because they are invested in my well-being with good faith? Or are they owed nothing because what they actually want is control dressed up as concern? A boss asking why a deadline slipped, so the team can adjust. That's good faith. And clarity serves everyone. A relative demanding to know why you didn't attend an event, so they can make you feel guilty for existing on your own terms. That's not a request for information. That's an attempt to reclaim authority over your life that was never theirs. Learn to tell the difference. It will save you thousands of hours and an ocean of resentment. If you've ever spent an entire car ride home replaying an explanation you gave to someone who didn't even deserve one, you already know exactly what I'm talking about. Let me know in the comments who that person was for you. You don't have to name them. Just tell us the relationship. Mother, boss, ex, friend. I promise you're not alone. James was a contractor, the kind of man who'd built half the houses in his small town with his own two hands, and he had a business partner named Danny who talked faster than James could think. When a deal fell through, no fault of James's, a client had simply backed out. Danny cornered him at the site office, demanding an account, a defense, a scapegoat. James stood there, and instead of the flood of justification Danny expected, James said only, "It fell through." We moved to the next one. Danny sputtered. He wanted a fight. He wanted James to defend himself so Danny would have something to argue against. But you cannot argue with a wall that doesn't push back. You can only exhaust yourself against it. Within a week, Danny had calmed down entirely, because James had given him nothing to feed on. This is one of the most underused weapons in the entire Stoic arsenal. Silence deprives conflict of its oxygen. Seneca, in his letters to his friend Lucilius, wrote extensively about the wise man's relationship to insult and provocation. His core teaching was this: a person secure in their own judgment does not need to answer every accusation, because an accusation only wounds you if you first agree, somewhere inside yourself, that it might be true. If you know who you are, someone else's noise about who they think you are simply doesn't land. Notice something important here. Silence is not the same as suppression. James wasn't swallowing rage. He wasn't performing calm while seething underneath. He had genuinely, internally, already settled the matter before Danny even opened his mouth. That's the difference between stoic silence and simply keeping the peace while dying inside. One is control. The other is quiet self-abandonment. So how do you build this? Start small. The next time someone says something designed to provoke a defense out of you, a snide comment, a passive-aggressive text, some people would say, try counting to 5 in your head before responding at all. Not to be dramatic. Just to check. Am I about to speak from my values or from my wounded pride? Marcus Aurelius kept returning to a single image in his meditations, that of a rock standing firm while waves crash and break. Around it, unmoved, and the water eventually settles itself back into calm. He wasn't describing indifference. He was describing a kind of strength so deep it doesn't need to announce itself. Your silence, used correctly, is not you losing the argument. It's you refusing to enter an arena that was never worth stepping into. Here's an uncomfortable truth the Stoics understood better than almost any philosophy before or since. You can live with total integrity and still be completely misunderstood, and that is not a reflection of your failure. Marco, a nurse working night shifts at a regional hospital, learned this the hard way. A patient's family accused him of negligence after a difficult outcome that had nothing to do with his care. The truth was documented, clear, defensible, but the family needed someone to blame, and Marco was the face in the room when their world fell apart. For months, Marco replayed the conversation, trying to find the right words that would have made them understand. He lost sleep over people who had already decided, before he opened his mouth, what story they needed to believe. Epictetus would have told Marco something quite direct. Other people's misunderstanding of you is their judgment to carry, not yours. You are responsible for your actions, your intentions, your integrity. You are not responsible for the interpretation someone else assigns to them, especially when that interpretation is shaped by their own grief, fear, insecurity, or need for a villain. This is one of the hardest lessons in the entire Stoic framework, because it goes against every social instinct we have. We are wired evolutionarily to care intensely about how the tribe perceives us. For most of human history, being misunderstood by your group could mean exile, and exile could mean death. Your nervous system still reacts to being misjudged, as though it might get you cast out to die in the cold. But you are not living in that world anymore. Being misunderstood by a coworker, a distant relative, or a stranger online will not end your life. It only feels that catastrophic because an ancient part of your brain hasn't caught up to modern safety. Marcus Aurelius, ruling the most powerful empire on earth, was still slandered, still misjudged by senators, still resented by people who never met him. If total imperial power couldn't buy him universal understanding, no amount of explaining on your part will buy you the same from people committed to misreading you. Here's the freeing part of this lesson, and I want you to really let this land. Once you accept that misunderstanding is sometimes simply the cost of being a person other people have opinions about. You stop trying to control the uncontrollable. You redirect that energy toward the only thing that was ever within your power, living in a way you can stand behind, regardless of who's watching or what story they've already written about you. If this lesson is hitting somewhere specific for you right now, hit that like button. Not for me, for the version of you that's finally learning to let go of a misunderstanding that was never yours to fix. And if you know someone who's been carrying that weight, this might be the video to send them. Somewhere along the way, we absorbed a strange cultural belief that a boundary is only valid if it comes with a fully footnoted argument explaining why you're allowed to have it. "I can't make it this weekend" becomes a 3-paragraph explanation involving your work schedule, your energy levels, a prior commitment, and an apology for even asking to be excused. The Stoics would find this exhausting, and rightly so. Epictetus taught that the wise person's no requires no committee approval. A boundary is not a proposal up for debate. It's a statement of your own governance over your own life, time, and energy. The moment you attach a defense to it, you've quietly reframed it as a request for permission. Elena, the designer from Lesson 1, ran into this again a few months after the promotion conversation with her father. A close friend asked her to be a bridesmaid, which meant an expensive dress, a destination bachelorette trip, and months of unpaid emotional labor. Elena simply didn't have room for that year. Old Elena would have written an essay. New Elena, still practicing, said, "I'm so happy for you, and I can't take on that role right now." Her friend pushed. "But why not? You have time for everything else." And here's the crucial moment, the one where most people cave. Elena felt the old pull to list every reason, to build the case, to make her no so airtight that no one could argue with it. Instead, she repeated gently, without escalating, "I understand it's disappointing. My answer is still no. No defense committee, no trial, just a boundary stated once, held twice." Marcus Aurelius wrote that we suffer more from our opinion of a thing than from the thing itself, and a no that requires defending has already been reframed internally as something shameful that needs to be excused. But a boundary rooted in genuine self-respect doesn't need an excuse any more than a locked door needs to. Apologize for keeping the house safe. Here's the practical exercise I want you to try this week. The next time you set a boundary, notice the urge to keep talking after you've said the actual sentence. That urge, that need to keep adding justification, is the wound talking, not the wisdom. Practice stopping at the period. Let the silence after your no sit there, uncomfortable and whole, without rushing to fill it. It gets easier. I promise you it gets easier. There's a particular kind of pain reserved for being judged by someone who has never once tried to actually know you. A co-worker who decided you were arrogant based on one quiet meeting. A distant cousin who decided you were irresponsible based on one social media post. A stranger online who decided who you are based on 15 seconds of a video stripped of all context. Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself in the dead of night in a military tent on the frontier of his empire, addressed this directly. He reminded himself that it is not other people's actions or judgments that disturb us. It is our own belief that their judgment carries authority over our reality. Think about that carefully. The stranger's opinion of you doesn't hurt because the opinion is powerful. It hurts because some part of you has quietly agreed to let it be the verdict. Here's a thought experiment the Stoics would want you to run. Imagine the specific person whose judgment stings the most right now. Now imagine they had never been born, and someone with the exact same opinion existed on the other side of the world. Someone you will never meet, whose thoughts about you will never once intersect with your actual life. Would that opinion still hurt in the same way? Almost certainly not, because distance reveals what proximity disguises. The opinion itself never had power, only your relationship to it did. Epictetus used to challenge his students with a phrase that sounds almost rude out of context, but is deeply liberating once understood. Who are you to them, that they should think so highly of themselves as to have the final say on your worth? He wasn't encouraging arrogance. He was pointing out that we grant strangers, acquaintances, and even hostile critics an authority over our self-concept that we would never consciously agree to if we thought about it directly. James, the contractor, ran into this when an online review from a client he'd never even worked with, a case of mistaken business identity, called his company's work shoddy and dishonest. His first instinct was panic, a need to respond, defend, correct the record publicly, prove himself to a stranger who had already decided the narrative. He wrote 3 different responses, deleted all 3, and finally understood something his father, a quiet man of few words, used to say. A barking dog 2 streets over doesn't need you to come outside and argue with it. The review sat there factually wrong for anyone who cared to check his actual work and testimonials. James let it. And within a month, it had sunk beneath dozens of real reviews from real clients. The truth, given time and no interference, tends to settle into its rightful place. Not every battle for your reputation is worth fighting. Some are worth simply outliving. Quick pause here. If you're watching this at night, unable to sleep because of something someone said about you today, I want you to comment the words "letting go" below, not as a performance, just so future you, scrolling back through this later, can see how many people were carrying the exact same weight tonight, and how many of them chose to put it down. This one is tender, so stay with me. Somewhere in childhood, many of us learned a dangerous equation. If I can just explain myself well enough, they will finally understand me. And once they understand me, they will finally love me the way I need. It's a devastating trap, because it's built on a false premise. Love that requires a perfect explanation to be granted was never unconditional in the first place. It was a transaction, and you were always the one paying. Seneca wrote to his friend Lucilius about the nature of true friendship, insisting that a real bond doesn't survive on constant justification. It survives on trust that doesn't need to be renewed through argument every time a disagreement arises. If someone only stays connected to you while you're explaining, defending and proving yourself, ask honestly, is that connection? Or is that a job interview that never ends? Elena's mother was, for most of Elena's adult life, someone who required constant explanation as the price of approval. Every choice, her career, her apartment, her relationships needed defending. As though love were a court case Elena had to keep winning. And for years Elena did it. She built airtight arguments for her own existence. The shift came slowly, not in one dramatic confrontation, but in a quiet decision Elena made after a long conversation with a therapist. She would offer information when it was freely wanted, but she would stop performing defense in exchange for affection. If her mother wanted closeness, it would have to be built on acceptance, not litigation. It was, Elena said later, one of the loneliest periods of her life, because some relationships genuinely cannot survive the removal of the explaining. Her mother pulled back for a while, but something else happened too. The relationships that could survive it. A few real friendships. A partner who never once demanded a defense for her feelings deepened, because they had never needed the performance in the first place. Marcus Aurelius reminds us that we should be careful not to waste the brief time we have, trying to be loved by people whose love was never freely given, because that pursuit is, by definition, endless. There is no explanation eloquent enough to manufacture a love that was conditional from the start. You cannot argue someone into loving you well. You can only become someone who no longer needs them to. Here is the moment that changes everything, and I promised you at the start of this video that it would. Every time you walk into a room, a meeting, a family dinner, a first date, a job interview, carrying an invisible permission slip, asking silently to be allowed to take up the space you're already standing in, you are handing your power to a room that never actually asked for that transaction. Watch how differently people move through the world once they stop doing this. Not arrogantly, not without care for others, but settled. The way Marcus Aurelius must have walked into the Senate even as men plotted against him. The way Epictetus must have taught his classes even after a lifetime of being told, quite literally, that he was property and not a person. Here's the exercise. The next time you walk into a room where you feel that old pull to shrink, to over-explain your presence, to apologize for existing at full volume, pause for exactly one breath before you speak. In that breath, silently remind yourself of one sentence. I don't need permission to be here. Not because you're better than anyone in that room. Because you were never required to earn your basic right to exist, speak and take up space in the first place. That right was never up for negotiation. You were born holding it. And every explanation you've given since has simply been you, unknowingly, handing pieces of it away. Marco experienced this directly the first time he walked into a hospital review meeting after the incident with the grieving family. He expected to feel small, defensive, ready to justify every decision he'd made that night. Instead, for the first time, he walked in simply prepared to state the facts. No apology in his posture. No permission-seeking in his tone. Not cold, just clear. The room responded to his clarity, not his defensiveness. People tend to mirror the energy you bring. When you walk in, already convinced you need to earn your place, people unconsciously start looking for reasons to agree with you. When you walk in simply occupying the space you already have every right to occupy, the questioning largely stops on its own, because you never opened the door to it. This is not confidence as performance. This is sovereignty as a quiet, internal fact. Practice it once this week. One room, one meeting, one conversation where you'd normally shrink first and speak second. Flip the order. Speak from the settled place, and let the room catch up to you instead of the other way around. If Lesson 7 landed the way I think it might have, comment the word settled below. I want to build a place in these comments where we can see together how many of us are learning to stop apologizing for the space we already deserve to take up. Every time you over-explain to someone who exploits that habit, you are not just exhausting yourself in that single moment. You are training them, however unintentionally, on how to treat you going forward. This is one of the harder truths in Stoic thought, because it removes the comfort of pure victimhood. The Stoics never denied that other people can behave badly. Seneca lived under Nero, a man capable of extraordinary cruelty, but Stoic philosophy insists on examining your own role in the patterns that repeat in your life. Not to blame yourself for others' bad behavior, but because your response is the only lever you actually control. Danny, James's business partner, had learned over years that if he pushed hard enough, loud enough, long enough, James would eventually cave and provide the defensive explanation Danny was fishing for. Every time James caved, the pattern reinforced itself a little deeper. It wasn't until James changed his own response, not Danny's behavior, which was never his to change, that the entire dynamic between them shifted. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about the discipline of examining your own reactions rather than fixating on other people's flaws, not because other people's flaws don't exist, but because fixating on them without changing your own response is a guaranteed path to repeating the exact same, suffering indefinitely. Ask yourself honestly, is there a relationship in your life right now where you keep explaining yourself to someone who has shown you, through repeated behavior, that no explanation will ever be enough? If so, the uncomfortable Stoic question is this: not, how do I get them to finally understand, but why do I keep offering an explanation to someone who has already demonstrated they don't want one, they want a way in? This is not about becoming suspicious of everyone or refusing all vulnerability. Real earned trust deserves openness, but there is a specific kind of person who uses your explanations as ammunition, as a foothold to keep the argument going, as proof that you're still available to be pulled into their orbit of conflict. Recognizing that pattern and simply declining to feed it anymore is one of the most powerful shifts you can make. The goal isn't to become unreachable. The goal is to become selective about who gets access to your reasoning, the same way you'd be selective about who gets a key to your home. There's a quiet lie many of us absorb without noticing, that peace is something we earn after we've successfully managed everyone else's opinion of us. Once they finally understand, once they finally approve, once the explanation lands perfectly and the conflict resolves cleanly, then we tell ourselves we'll finally feel calm. The Stoics flip this entirely. Peace is not the reward that arrives after the external world cooperates. Peace is a discipline you practice, regardless of whether the external world ever cooperates at all. Epictetus, teaching students in a small room in Nicopolis, had far less external power than almost anyone he taught. He had once been enslaved, his body treated as another man's property, and yet his central teaching was that peace was always entirely available to him because it was located in his judgments, not his circumstances. Nobody could enslave his mind, even when they had once enslaved his body. This reframes the entire project of reclaiming your power. It's not about finally winning the argument, finally getting the apology, finally making the difficult relative understand. It's about recognizing that your peace was never actually contingent on any of those outcomes in the first place. You simply believed it was, and so you kept postponing it, waiting for permission that was never going to arrive from outside yourself. Marco started practicing something simple after the hospital incident, a short pause each morning before his shift, just a few minutes, where he reminded himself of what was in his control that day, his care, his focus, his integrity, and what wasn't. How a grieving family might interpret events beyond anyone's control. How a colleague might judge a decision without full context. It didn't eliminate the hard days, but it meant he stopped carrying the full weight of other people's reactions home with him every night. This is the daily, unglamorous work of Stoicism, not a single dramatic breakthrough, but a repeated, quiet practice of returning your attention to what's actually yours to manage. Try this tomorrow morning, before you check your phone. Before the day's noise arrives, take 60 seconds and simply name, out loud or in your head, one thing today that is within your control, and one thing that isn't. That's the whole exercise. Do it for a week and notice what shifts. We end where we began, but with different eyes. Elena, James, and Marco, 3 different lives, 3 different professions, 3 different wounds, all arrived at the same quiet realization by the end of their respective stories. The explaining was never actually required. It was a habit born of an old, understandable fear. The fear that if you didn't justify yourself well enough, you'd be judged, rejected, unloved, cast out. But look at what actually happened once each of them stopped. Elena's father accepted her answer far more easily than she expected. Danny's provocations lost their fuel once James stopped feeding them. The stranger's false review sank beneath the truth once James let it. Marco walked into rooms with clarity instead of apology, and the rooms responded in kind. None of them became colder people. None of them stopped caring about the people in their lives. What changed was far more precise than that. They stopped confusing self-respect with selfishness and boundaries with cruelty. Marcus Aurelius, in one of his most quoted passages, reminded himself each morning that he would likely encounter difficult, ungrateful, unreasonable people that day, and rather than being surprised or destabilized by this, he simply resolved in advance not to let their disposition dictate his own. He wasn't hardening himself against connection. He was refusing to let his peace be a hostage to other people's choices. This is the final full-circle truth of everything we've covered today. You were never the one who needed to change to earn your peace, your worth, or your place in any room. The explaining, the defending, the endless justifying, all of it was an old strategy for staying safe in a world that once felt too dangerous to simply exist in plainly. You don't need that strategy anymore. You're allowed to set it down. We started this video with a person standing at the edge of a room full of noise, exhausted from a lifetime of explaining. I want you to picture that person one more time, but picture them now. After everything we've walked through together, they turn around. They don't owe the room a speech. They don't owe the room a defense. They simply meet its gaze, steady, and the room, sensing that steadiness, quiets on its own. That's not a fantasy. That's available to you starting today in the next conversation where you feel that old pull to over-explain. 10 lessons. One thread running through all of them. Your worth was never something other people got to grade. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire and still wrote to himself at night like a student who hadn't yet mastered the material, because Stoicism was never about arriving at perfect peace and staying there forever. It's a daily practice, a discipline you return to again and again, especially on the days it feels hardest. So here's what I want you to do, not later, now, or the next time this comes up today. The next time you feel the urge to explain a decision that needs no defense, pause, breathe, and ask yourself the only question that actually matters. Is this person owed clarity, or have I simply been giving it away out of old habit? If this video gave you even one sentence you'll carry into tomorrow, that was the entire point of making it. If you found value in this, I genuinely appreciate you hitting like. It's a small action that tells YouTube to show this to someone else who might need to hear it exactly today. If you want more of this kind of grounded, practical Stoic philosophy delivered every week, subscribe to Wisdom of the Stoics and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And if there's someone in your life who over-explains, over-justifies, over-apologizes for simply existing, send them this video. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is show them they never needed permission in the first place. Tell me in the comments, which of these 10 lessons do you need to practice this week? I read every single one, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay grounded, stay unshaken, and stop explaining yourself.